Well, welcome everybody. Glad that you've joined us again for this fourth and final part of our study on why work to decolonize. Glad that you've joined us this evening for our study, and thank you for being on this journey with me. As we've been saying time and time again, we are not experts, but we are on this journey together, trying to learn and understand things a bit better. Sometimes we might not say things exactly right, or we might be limited in our understanding, but that's all part of this journey. So thank you for your bravery in being willing to be recorded for this study. And I have heard from a few others that they have been watching the study and keeping up with it, but not able to join us on Wednesday evenings. This is our last one tonight. It's going to be a bit longer, and it's going to have a little more church content. So that should be interesting for our conversation tonight as we end off on the church's role and think about that a little bit more. So let's start in prayer and we'll begin. Let's pray. Gracious God, we come before you this night with thoughts for our Indigenous sisters and brothers. Be with us as we have this conversation, as we unpack some of the stories of the people who were impacted by residential schools, the people who've been traumatized and impacted by the decisions of colonization, the actions of people who are a part of our community, people who would call themselves Christian, who have been Christian leaders, denominations that served in a variety of different ways to participate in the colonization and assimilation in many ways of our Indigenous peoples. So open our hearts, hold us close as we hear the stories and as we unpack some of this important information this evening. We pray all this in Jesus' name and for his sake. Amen. So as always, we start with our, our 4 agreements, which is the work of Glenn Singleton. And it's really about staying engaged and experiencing discomfort and speaking our own truth and expecting and accepting non-closure. So as the study walks through this last section, the first part of our section tonight is called the Church and Gendered Oppression. And in the study, it talks again about Sija, who we talked about last week, how she identified to the inquiry that it was actually a church worker, a pastor, in fact, who helped her and her partner to find adequate housing and set her on a path to recovery and security. But the church, it has to be admitted, has also been a source of trauma in many Indigenous people's lives. And the inquiry noted that it was Christian missionaries and teachers who helped instill a patriarchal and misogynistic idea and practice into Indigenous communities. And it's to say that at least in part, some of the roots of the violence that have been experienced by Indigenous women and girls and LGBTQ people stems actually from this mission work, the theological teachings of the Christian church and how it understood things at this time. So the final report of the National Inquiry is quite clear that Christian missionaries introduced patriarchal ideals and values of what it means to be male or female, and also the belief that those are the only 2 acceptable options. And it also imposed those beliefs on Indigenous cultures. The report noted that many Indigenous cultures did not have a strict hierarchy of gender, with male persons valued as more than female persons prior to European contact, and that many Indigenous nations did not confine gender to only male and female. And it's interesting, if you go a little deeper in the study on this part around gender diversity, it speaks about how the Christian church essentially put pressure on the Indigenous community to embrace that there are only 2 genders. It's so therefore erased or tried to erase an entire spectrum of people who had lived in communities since time immemorial. And so the way it did that, it also imposed that within the residential school system. In the report, it says it this way: Christian dogma reinforced a patriarchal system that envisioned God as male and women as a secondary creation meant to keep the company of men. And overwhelmingly in schools, They were separated by the sexes. Boys and girls had different dormitories, entrances, classes, chores, recesses, and playgrounds. And the separation had many effects. They separated families, of course. So brothers and sisters, male, female, and male and female cousins were all forbidden from interacting with each other. So not only were the children taken away from their parents, their extended families, and the communities to attend school, but they were also forbidden to find comfort with their relatives of other genders while they were there. And this practice was completely foreign to Indigenous children's experiences at home. It certainly undermined the development of basic skills for maintaining healthy, multi-gendered relationships. And also the teachings of the missionaries around sexual orientation in many Indigenous cultures had devastating consequences within those cultures, because in their culture, sexuality wasn't limited to heterosexuality as the only acceptable orientation. And so when Christian missionaries came and began to evangelize and work amongst Indigenous peoples, all supported through the doctrine of discovery, which is something we're going to unpack in a few minutes, they taught strict beliefs about gender, sexuality, and marriage as core aspects of their mission work. And one of the people who spoke into the report was speaking from her Métis experience, and this is what they had to say. So they said Christian doctrine was instrumental in forcing Métis women into roles defined by gendered European expectations. Church fathers saw the husband as the head of the family and expected women to adhere to masculine authority. Catholic priests in particular related women to biblical Eve and constructed a view of them as naturally sinful. These gendered ideas would have had a negative impact on the position of women in Métis society. In this worldview, the position of women was domestic. They belonged in the home and in a marriage. And priests often counseled women to remain subservient in a marriage, no matter the conditions of the marriage, including in abusive relationships. So I just want to pause there for just a moment and just speak to that in the context of maybe even the Christian church's influence on the family and gender dynamics throughout history. While this perspective and worldview has certainly had quite an impact on Indigenous culture and Indigenous society and Indigenous peoples, this was the culture that had been imposed within a certain worldview for generations within European culture. And so not only did we impose that kind of perspective from a theological perspective onto another culture, but some of the stuff that we're unpacking tonight, I think also speaks to how some people are rethinking and relearning and expanding their viewpoints on some of the things that we took as maybe normative, maybe even just a generation ago, and maybe even in some Christian streams continue to see as normative, or to use another term, biblical, as a way of understanding the perspective of, roles of women, roles of men, and then sexuality as a whole. So the study is sort of pushing out that this was something that was imposed on an Indigenous culture who had their own culture, their own very specific culture. But I think it's also important to note that this has been something that we've lived with in the European context, for those who've lived through the European context for generations. And maybe in the last couple of generations, some of that's being unpacked and changed and transformed. Any comment on just that, just before we go to our next bit? And if not, that's okay.
Yeah,
just
no,
go ahead, Rhonda. Yeah,
this really opened up my eyes more. Certainly, I was aware of it in my own experience as a child growing up in the church and that type of thing, and in discussion of women's roles. And I had never really made the connection between the women in the murdered Métis and Indigenous women and the role that they were assigned by the Christian missionaries. That was, I sort of knew it was there, but I never really saw it this openly. And it's been quite a revelation to me. And I
Hmm.
just think of teaching about Indigenous culture and all the resources that I had as a teacher. It was very much divided of labor. The women were at home raising the children and sowing the crops if they were agricultural, and the men were all the hunters. And
Mm.
that probably is not truth. It's just the European interpretation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Very likely. Right.
Yeah.
From what we understand, if we listen to some of the history and the oral tradition within the Indigenous community, it appears that many of their leaders have been women. Women are often considered like the elder women are considered sort of the leaders of the community and would actually have extreme, a lot of power and control over the warriors, the young men.
Mm-hmm.
They would be the ones who'd make the decision as to whether or not a community would go to war or have to do something like that. And so, yeah, it's one thing to be raised and steeped in a certain culture and then work on unpacking that in the generation maybe we're in now and beyond. But it's another thing to take that culture and uh, make it collide against another culture that had a very different perspective on how things, how they understood people, how they understood gender, how they understood roles and things like that. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So let's carry on with within the study. Again, it's talking about the position of women here. So one of the things it says in the study is the freedom and self-determination exercised by Indigenous women was seen as contrary to Christian values and a great obstacle to the faith of Jesus Christ. And again, what I find interesting in this within the study is, that these are some of the things that were stated when the women's movement was trying to give women, at least white, more powerful women, the vote in the turn of the previous century. These were some of the kinds of things that were being said. This is against Christian values. It's against what the Bible says, where a man is the head of the household and things like that. So these kind of perspectives that were put forward within the Indigenous community for the Presbyterian Church in Canada, we've made some reports on how we understand the position of women, and so it references a bit of that here. We in 1994 there was a report on sexuality from the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and this is what it said. Some aspects of Christian tradition have added unhelpful principles and priorities for the church in its response to sexual violence in particular. The ancient propensity to identify womankind with the flesh and its evil desire sets up women as targets of that desire who can then be interpreted to deserve or even enjoy what they get. The view of women as the temptress feeds the tendency to blame the victim, ignoring the suffering of those who experience acts of sexual violence. And attitudes about the rights of the husband within marriage have caused the church to ignore or underestimate the effects of violence within the home on both women and children. Now, the teachings in the report that the report describes by the missionaries bringing this into the Indigenous communities were based on understandings that women were of a less value than men, and they just disrupted pre-existing relationship structures in Indigenous communities. And patriarchal teachings destabilized Indigenous women's leadership and were aimed at making Indigenous communities easier to dominate. So one of the things they did do was remove women from leadership, sort of citing it's not a Christian value to have a woman in leadership or have a woman in authority. And it was meant to actually, they then put certain men in place who were controlled or manipulated or forced to serve in a certain role, even though that's not what they were traditionally used to. And so in the report's words, it says this: the imposition of patriarchal European values meant that exerting control and dominance over Indigenous women was an important aspect of colonization. The freedom and self-determination exercised by Indigenous women was seen as contrary to Christian values and a great obstacle to the faith of Jesus Christ. And so one of the words I wanted to just unpack for a moment is just this phrase, the doctrine of discovery. And you might be excited to know, it only took us, a couple centuries, millennia, and no, just centuries, to actually repudiate it. So meaning that we decided as Presbyterians that we were no longer going to adhere to this doctrine and that it was a wrong doctrine. And you can Google this on your own time as well, but let me just give you the basics. So the doctrine of discovery is a set of concepts developed from a series of papal bulls. Papal bulls are what the Pope would issue, and they call them bulls. It's not actual bulls. And they are of these decrees that are issued, and these were all issued around the 15th century. And it goes in the hand in hand with the concept known as terra nullius. And it's a Latin expression meaning empty land. And so these bulls that were developed, these doctrines or decrees, supported the concepts giving theological justification and legal backing to European monarchs to invade and seize non-Christian lands and enslave non-Christian people in perpetuity and take their property. And so the Pope would issue these doctrines or these statements and say, this is what you're allowed to do. So then all these sort of explorers, as we called them, or people would come, and these colonial powers had the right to appropriate lands and possessions and treat non-Christians as undeserving of rights. It all flows from this doctrine itself. And it certainly heavily influenced the legislation that eventually governed Indigenous Crown relations, like all the way through. So the idea was that, when we arrived, as many of us have heard, when we arrived on this land, there was either nobody here or it was completely uncivilized. And so we came as Europeans to this land and discovered it. And then if there were people there, we civilized them. In 2019, the General Assembly repudiated this doctrine, which means we said it's not a good doctrine. And Presbyterians and church courts were encouraged to study it and look at this and understand better the ramifications of this concept used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples in Canada. And so I will include in the notes from today's conversation in the YouTube. I'll have a link. There's a video that's on the Presbyterian Church in Canada website that's very good that goes through this doctrine as well. So another thing just to be aware of, and welcome to Dallas as well, who's joined us for our study as well. Just to acknowledge this. So in our confession that I read last week, this is what it says. And again, I think some folks had some comments about the confession itself, and we might get into that maybe in the chat later. So we acknowledge that the stated policy of the government of Canada was to assimilate Aboriginal peoples, to dominate their culture, and that the Presbyterian Church in Canada cooperated in this policy. We acknowledge that the roots of the harm we have done are found in the attitudes and values of Western European colonialism, and the assumption that what was not yet molded in our image was to be discovered and exploited. And so this comes out of this doctrine of discovery. Now, while practices varied within denominations and even across individual missionaries, of course, beliefs such as these shaped the work of many early Christian missionaries. It helped contribute to the roots of the crisis of violence faced by many women, Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQ people today. And so again, just to maybe have a moment to unpack some of this, the report talks about the freedom and self-determination exercised by Indigenous women was seen as contrary to Christian values and a great obstacle to the faith of Jesus Christ. And so from what you know or have heard of early missionaries, in which ways do you think this is an accurate quote? And in what ways could the church give a different witness today? How would it speak to this in a different way today? Maybe just to give some thought to that. I'll give a moment or two to let you think about that. And if you want to comment, you're welcome to. And if you don't, that's okay too. Let's move on to the second question, just to leave that for.
Comment.
Go ahead. Yes.
I don't know much about missionaries, so I can't really comment on that. But I think there's probably and I think this is what's so important is what can we do today that is different. And one of them is the acceptance of all, I guess, sexuality and gender and different kind of ways that people have, but not. And then also in the context of Indigenous peoples is to, I guess, almost like reparations in some way, and I think that's happening in terms of different initiatives and stuff, but I think it has to be maybe more intentional. But I don't know enough about what happens in the broader General Assembly type church. I feel like you have talked about this and not everybody's accepting of it, but I don't know for sure. Sorry, it was a bit mixed up.
No, it's great. Yeah, I think it's. I would agree with Kate that there's a. I think we spoke to this before. There's a disconnect between what, maybe within all organizations or institutions, there's often a disconnect between what's said from the top or from the larger body to the just average folks. So, and one of the stopgaps in that is ministers themselves. Maybe I can blame myself as a part of it. We participate in General Assembly. 1/6 of the church participates every year by representative elders of each congregation across the country, and a minister from each of the congregations across the country. 1/6 of those meet once a year annually. And there's a couple of committees and organizations within the national church, Justice Ministries, who were part of creating this resource, who spend a lot of time all year long having meetings with certain special people, I guess, or invited persons, create resources, create recommendations, and then they present them to our General Assembly to vote on, basically. And then at that assembly, depending on the mix of the people in there, they might vote in favor of something, or they might want to edit something or change something. And then at the end of it, there's this sort of huge laundry list of things that are basically sent down to churches for discussion and comment. But the average church, they're lucky if they spend any amount of time talking about all the different things the General Assembly agrees to. It often comes much later that people actually realize, oh, our church believes that? I had no idea. So the local church is really heavily influenced by, I'll say the minister in one way, and whatever they decide to allow themselves to be impacted by from our larger national body when we make those decisions. And so even reports like this, or this study guide that's been released, it depends on how many churches will actually look at it across the country. Not every church will. And so to come to your point of, how does that then get distilled into action? That's where you'll have quite a diversity of some churches who have never even spoken about Indigenous issues, to other churches speaking about it all the time, to churches actually taking significant action and developing relationships with Indigenous communities. So yeah, lots of diversity from where it gets talked in the larger body to here, for sure.
John, I was going to, first of all, sorry for being late, got distracted, bunch of things.
No problem.
I'm looking at a couple of things here. I'm looking at the missionaries, and I'm a little bit upset with that word, early missionaries. In 1999, I lived in Kenya for about 3 or 4 months doing volunteer work. It was non-denominational, it was non-Christian, it was just work. One of the young girls that I worked with at the orphanage, her English was King James Version of the Bible English. That's how she spoke, like that. Obviously, somebody introduced her to that, and I'm not gendering this. It just happens that it was a young girl in this case, I believe. I may be wrong, but I'm believing that this just happens to be, and that was the English that she learned, and she was given a King James Bible, and she thou'd and thy, and while she was talking to people, not just me, but anybody. And I found it, as somebody who has been a Christian for most of my life, who stepped away for a little while. And part of the reason why I stepped away was things like this. That being said, at the same time, there was a small village that one of my other friends worked at, and they had tried everything they could to get rid of cholera in this village. Boil your water is a simple thing. It's our masking right now. Simply put a mask on, wash your hands. We're going to be good. That was the same kind of idea there. Nobody wanted to listen. Nobody wanted to listen. A missionary came in and found some obscure part of the Bible that he interpreted as boil your water. And that whole village started boiling their water because God told them to, and they got rid of cholera. So this is somebody who has taken a different approach to it. To do this. I talked with this guy, and he wasn't your preachy type of minister either. Or missionary either, but he did that to make something work, and definitely it worked. But then also going along what you said about, each of the different churches in Canada or even locally, see different things and have different views of how they look at whatever. One of my big ones of why I left the church in Lindsay, Ontario, St. Andrews and Lindsay, was their stance. And actually at this point, even in PYPS, Presbyterian Young People's Society, there was a lot of very homophobic views going on at the time, even though the Presbyterian Church as a whole had made decisions of this was okay, this was fine, we are accepting, we are fine with people in the LGBT community. As ministers, we are all encompassing, not quite the United Church level of it, but they were pretty cool about it. But then even that church was pretty bad. I have a good friend of mine that you probably know, so I'm not going to mention any names, was a minister in a church. When he came out, there was a lot of issue with that. And again, I'm hearing his side and not the rest, but he was basically kicked out of his ministry. He's since found another one. He's married his husband, and now it's very positive, but it was a really dark time for him. And this is in an accepting place. And we're talking the last decade. We're not talking in the, early days of missionaries that didn't know any better, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I think it's interesting. Like what I found as I walked through this part of the study, and I mentioned this a little earlier as well, is, I don't want us to get too distracted by this piece, but there's that sense of, because I think really the core point of this is we took our worldview and imposed it on another group of people who had a very different worldview. But I think I think it was last week I talked about, maybe, or I can't remember where, I talked about doing our own work. Like a lot of what we need to do when we start walking through some of this is doing our own work, whether that's as individuals or also as communities and collectives, in the sense that, as I hear some of this stuff around perspectives on the role of women and the perspective of the role of men and gendered kind of understandings of things, and how we understand LGBTQ, I think we as individual Christians within the Christian church and within the Presbyterian Church in Canada still need to do that work for ourselves, because like you say, I'm not sure we're finished yet. Like we're not there yet. There still isn't a sense of across the denomination, we're, for lack of a better expression, we're not inclusive across the denomination. You'll still find lots of examples of homophobia. You'll still find lots of examples of very traditional views of the roles of women and the roles of men. Churches that will not accept a female minister, will not accept female elders. These things still exist, and yet those things allegedly were dealt with in the 70s. But we still haven't moved beyond those. So I don't want to get us stuck there. But I just do name that as a part of our journey tonight as we think about that, because I think the biggest thing we need to think about is I was raised in that kind of worldview, whether it was in my home, the society I lived in, or the church culture I was a part of. Someone didn't come along while I was growing up and say, you can't think that way anymore. You have to think this way. And that's what happened to Indigenous peoples. And so we need to really acknowledge that as a part of our journey.
Can I just ask, like, sorry, I know you want to move on, but so would you say that those in the church, our church denomination, would admit that what happened was wrong? Is that something, do you think we've got to that place, that even the admission of it being not a good thing? Like,
So,
like say just residential schools, or, you know, and the mission work and so on.
right. So again, in answer to that, I would say there's such diversity, because we are a denomination that accepts or allows diversity to exist, and sometimes we celebrate that. Like that is part of the, really simplistically, when I was young, I used to think the cool thing about being Presbyterian was that you didn't have to all say or believe the exact same thing. And as a minister, I can tell you that I'm aware of the communities that I've served, that there have been people sitting in the pews who would have what we might call a fundamentalist, biblical literalist view of the Bible, and yet they come to church every single Sunday. And in the same pews, maybe a pew over or somewhere in the back or right up front, there's somebody who doesn't believe that God even exists, but they still come. So like atheists to like fundamentalists exist in the same spaces, and I've always appreciated that. In the same way, I would say the same way would be around questions like this. So our denomination, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, through its General Assembly, so it's essentially its mouthpiece, its figurehead, its large public statements, has confessed and said that residential schools were wrong, that we did wrong. They have attempted over the years to do the work of what you might call a little bit of reparation, more so probably a little bit of reconciliation, and sought to identify ways that they could be about doing the work of healing between the Indigenous community and the Presbyterian Church in Canada. How that distills out to every other congregation and every individual member, that's where you're going to get the diversity. Because I could tell you that there'll be either, there are members within St. Andrews that probably would say they're, residential schools have got a bad rap. They were mostly good. They were at least they taught them English. I don't know whether it was King James or not. I think you'd find congregations that would have, and I noticed that when I was going to school at Knox College, it was when Ipperwash was happening. And one of the young women in my class, like in my class of studies, her mom was the clerk of session at a church that was really close to Ipperwash. And the kind of conversations that were happening in our classroom that were being filtered through her mom to her, I wouldn't have called the most open in accepting why Indigenous people might have been acting up and standing up for their rights and speaking out during that time of what Ipperwash was that led to the death of Dudley George. And so it was interesting to hear that. And so that's where we get into, and one of our previous studies that we did in the summer that I put out there on video was around racism and hate. And some of the conversations I've heard over the years from Presbyterians in churches, ministers even, it doesn't border on racism and hate. It is racism and hate speak. It's, you can't say it's not. So that's one of the other pieces around how we unpack all this. People who live in Caledonia, they might have a different perspective. I'm sure they do. There might be there probably is diversity of opinion around how they encounter the Indigenous population around there. But again, I think it's one thing for the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Canada to say residential schools is wrong. It becomes our work as congregations or as individual members to make sure that trickles through us as well. Like that's part of who we are. So we're going to be a people who, If our General Assembly has said that residential schools are wrong, then we're going to be a people to do the groundwork of building relationships or learning more, learning our history, and trying to address that. That's sort of where we're at for that. So let me look at the next question. So actually, the Presbyterian Church in Canada has confessed its role in assimilation and colonialism. And the final report of the National Inquiry names as significant contributors to the crisis of MMIWG. It names. So, you know, it names within the report that this was part of our role, like we did the assimilation and colonialism work, and that's why it's been impactful. And so we read the confession last week, and so this is the question: how much do you think that confession, repenting of colonialism, has shaped the way your congregation acts today? So actually, you know, this leads into exactly what we were just talking about. You know, does the confession really lead to anything in specifics, and does it shape how we are as a congregation, or what we're doing, or how we're acting? I'd be curious to hear anybody's sort of thoughts on that, and then I could offer a couple thoughts as well.
This program is exactly proof that our congregation, you in particular, have taken this to heart and have done something about it. That being said, there's been 5 of us present, so that's kind of going with what Kate was saying too, right? It's not everybody, and not fair. Not everybody has time. Not everybody has the ability, but there's potential of your answer.
Yeah.
You're putting it out there. You're doing the work. That's part of your job. But you're also taking that a lot more seriously. I don't know who else is doing this across the synod, across the whole church, but you are. Mm-hmm. So at least we're making those steps, those acknowledgements.
Yeah, and one of the things I spoke to, the Justice Ministries invited me to do an article related to the other study we did over the summer, and one of the things I said in that was, you know, I named the privilege that I have, in the sense of I could choose not to. I mean, that's, you know, these studies, there are a whole bunch more studies in the Presbyterian Church in Canada that I haven't touched over the years that exist, but I never touched them. Partly because maybe I bought into a little bit of, you know, well, who's going to come? Like, if it's only a couple of us, what's the point, right? That kind of numbers game. But you know, that's been interesting to me. Like, these aren't you are, as a church, like the General Assembly doesn't say to a church, you are required to do this study. Like, it's not like a corporate organization that says, you all must do your diversity training, and here's the webinar, and we're going to be watching you through the computer to make sure that you did it. And once you get your certificate, you have to send it to your HR manager. We don't have that kind of thing. The only thing we have that related to our policy is we're supposed to get a police check, you know, once every few years, 5 years or something, in the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and present that to our presbytery. That's the only thing that's an absolute requirement. So maybe our denomination needs to make some of these things a requirement if they want us to take it seriously, but I don't know what that would look like in a denomination or in our church.
Would a requirement be beneficial?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Right. So I have to be a member of the church. Well, mm-hmm. I think that it's wrong, so I'm not coming anymore.
Yeah.
I don't even want to listen, or I'm going to just, you know, do this the whole time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I try to balance it a bit, at least in my role. I try to put some of this material into how I preach and how I pray in public worship, because that's where the largest audience is. But I'm also aware over the years, I mean, I don't have too many concerns at this part of my life. But when I was younger, you know, I was also aware of the feedback that I get occasionally. You know, I've always found it fascinating. The line that's used in the church often is, we don't want our minister to get too political. But as I read the Bible, at least how I read the Bible, oh my goodness, like, how can you not see that as political, I guess, if that's the phrase you want to use? It talks about, you know, overturning economic injustice. It talks about, speaking out against violence. It talks about, equity for all people. Yeah, I guess that's political. And the guy that got put up on a cross was basically a political criminal, essentially, of the state. He spoke out against the state, and that's wrong. And we're supposed to follow him. So, but I understand the sensibilities of people in the church who are feel more comfortable, because I think one of the fears we have is just as you said, Dallas, these are the things that can divide us, right? You can have people with different perspectives, and that will divide us. And will that mean we might lose members? Will that mean some people won't want to participate or hang out with us? And that's the risk we need to take, right? Like that's been the conversation related to, I'm sure when women were, I know actually when women were allowed to become ministers in the Presbyterian Church in Canada, some ministers left the church, some members of the church left the church because of that decision. In the United Church, when they agreed to become an inclusive denomination, members left the church, they walked. And that happens all sorts of denominations. So, sometimes we need to take a stand, and that's the risk you have to take as a part of that. Yeah. Any other comments on this part? Just around the confession, and, do you feel that there's ways that it shapes the congregation in any way at this point? Or maybe could?
I think you're absolutely right that it's very divisive within our society now, and to address the issues of, I think for me personally, it will be more trying to give, not to let things slide by when, oops, I've got something going on in my computer. Am I still with you?
You are still with us. Yeah.
Okay, I've lost you on my screen, but anyhow, I'll keep.
Okay, you can keep talking. Yep.
Yeah. It is. I've lost my train of thought because my computer's doing weird things. But I find what I can do personally is when something comes up where somebody makes a comment that, and it's hard at times, but just to address the issue of, for example, of clean water and the right to clean water. And well, they get so much money from the government, they don't pay taxes. And what more do we hand them out? That type of thing. Right. It's hard enough to address that. Mm-hmm. But let alone address how something as volatile as sexual identity, in saying that actually we're all wrong here, and we have been wrong for generations, and that's even deeper and more difficult to address. So I think one step at a time. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's not enough.
Yeah, I think how that resonates with me, Rhonda, is maybe it's tying into what Dallas had said about young peoples and stuff like that. The Young People's Society we were part of for the Presbyterian Church in Canada. They say around for like youth groups or young people's groups within churches, one of the benefits of having those is for young people to see other young people with similar belief systems, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe what the value of, say, a study like this or other kinds of gatherings or conversations about these kinds of issues is maybe that's where the solidarity piece comes in, so that it doesn't become just you, Rhonda, having a conversation with somebody in the community that is tense and challenging. It becomes you having that conversation, but you also knowing that you're not alone in this kind of perspective or view, not to use it as a hammer against somebody, but at least to know that, if all your, like, if your Facebook page is filled with people who are negative towards a particular issue, you might feel very alone. Mm-hmm. But if you know that there's a group of people who you meet with on a regular basis who actually are on the journey with you, then you might feel a little stronger in being able to know that you can stand your ground and have a conversation. Always try to maintain relationships as best you can, unless that's not possible based on how far something might go. But knowing also you have a place there you can kind of almost retreat to or be recharged by. I can go back into this space, and maybe that's what a church has been for a lot of people. They come back to a church and they hear some of the familiar things, or know that they're not alone in thinking a certain way, because sometimes it can feel very lonely, mm-hmm. believing in a deity, believing that there's something bigger than ourselves going on in a culture that says, meh, none of that's really, who buys that stuff? It's nice to come back to a church community and know that there's a group of people who are, from the society's perspective, just as foolish as you are, that wants to believe those things, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
communion.
Yeah, it's a communion. It's a gathering. Yeah.
So we have to watch out, because that's also that double-edged sword that, sure, we can find like-minded good people here,
Oh, yes,
but
yes.
just as easily
Yep.
like-minded, not so good people find each other. And that's
Absolutely.
what we're seeing a lot of right now, going on. It's not that there's more, and I'm using the term racist to mean like the bad racist, not your general everyday us that are racist, but the bad bit race. There's more. It isn't that there's more of them. It's that they found an echo chamber and they found friends before you had to keep your mouth shut. So there's also that negative, so that double-edged sword of that too, right?
Well, and I think lately, probably in the last, I don't know, maybe it's 20 years, maybe it's only 10, there's that sense of, there's always been that conversation related to the quiet majority, right? The people who don't stand up, the people who don't want to make waves, the people who want to just get along. And, we've seen in the Canadian context, the increase in the rise of more of the extremes, right? We've got extreme left, we've got extreme right, and they're very vocal and they have a lot to say. But there's this middle ground of people who, they don't want to lose friends on Facebook. They want to keep their families together. They want to get along at work. They've been told to be politically correct. You can't say this, you can't say that. But I do wonder what it would look like if that silent majority actually started speaking out more and saying, no, you know what? We're not going to buy your extremes. That's not what we're about. This is how we want to live our lives, that there's openness for all people. Like, we don't have to have this divide. And, maybe not to get very too political, but maybe a little bit of what we saw in the United States recently from that recent election has been helpful in that. There's still big numbers there of some people who voted for a certain way of thinking, but, maybe more people got out this time, more people voted, more people spoke, and now maybe we're going to see a change, and that would be a good thing. Let me carry on just for the sake of time and to sort of get to our sort of the end of our study today. So the other part that it spoke about was moving forward and respecting and supporting rights. And it speaks about this moment of encounter. We're having some learnings, we're having some awareness building within our community. And it advocates that we need to choose to contradict the destructive values and visions of colonialism and embrace pathways of love and justice instead. And we talked one time about disrupting the pathways to violence. And so is there things that individuals can do? Is there things that churches can do, Presbyterians, whomever? And if you look on the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls site, there's calls for justice there. And one of the things that myself and a friend tried to do at General Assembly, but it was a difficult General Assembly for a variety of reasons. We tried to, because the report had just been released during General Assembly, we tried to get the General Assembly to endorse the calls for justice and to encourage all congregations of the Presbyterian Church in Canada to endorse the calls for justice. But because they hadn't had time to read it, they decided not to. But luckily, what the compromise was that there are some calls for justice that are specifically for individuals. And so I'd encourage you to look through the calls for justice that are listed on the website and just sort of have a sense of what some of those look like. I mean, the big thing is about building relationships and trying to get a sense of understanding the other, learning from the other, not taking in that learning, but building those relationships, and also recognizing that that's a hard journey, because a lot of that relationship building has been broken because of distrust. If I walk into an Indigenous community space and say, hey, I'd like to build relationships, hey, sorry, Presbyterian minister here, sorry about the whole residential schools thing, want to build relationships. They're not going to necessarily just open their arms and embrace me and say, oh, come on in. It's got to be something that's sustainable and committing to. And a lot of the stuff I'm reading and listening to and taking in around anti-racism work this is a long journey. This isn't something we're fixing today or tomorrow or by next year. This is something you need to commit to. And I've always believed in one of our values at St. Andrews is partnership. And partnership is something that means that you're going to be in it for the long haul. Like, it's not something, we dabble in this week and then yeah, next week we change the channel, because that's what continues to damage these relationships. So Indigenous communities and Indigenous partners, even within, say Guelph, who one moment there was a flavor for the month, so there was some kind of relationship building with what might be considered a white organization or something connected to the government or a church, and then that church disappears, or that government organization disappears, or the money dries up. Well, they're kind of used to that. That just happens. And so we need to continue to not practice that kind of thing. So if we wanted to partner with somebody or get to know an organization, we need to be in that for the long haul. But we also need to make that a safe space for the people who are going to be a part of that relationship. And we can't guarantee safe spaces if we don't know for sure that everyone in our community is going to treat that as a safe space for people who are different from us. And so we need to really work on that work as well. The Justice Ministries did note that they are planning on bringing some recommendations to the next General Assembly. So it'll be interesting. That's in 2021. It'll be interesting what their recommendations are based on this report. If you remember, this study guide is like an interim report, and then the next one is going to be recommendations. So it'll be interesting to see what the Assembly receives as recommendations, and then what it actually approves as recommendations. And maybe part of the conversation of us, the six of us, from tonight is, once we get those recommendations, we should share them as a congregation and see what tangible things we could do as a congregation to continue that work. At least then it'll be like a General Assembly thing down to a congregation thing. But speaking to that diversity and something we talked about earlier, I came across this story, and this was just from a few days ago. This is related to an Abbotsford mom who, her daughter came to her, and I don't know if you can see it on the screen there, but the class was invited to learn a bit about residential schools. And as you see there, it says on the thing, and this was a grade, I think she was grade six. Thank you. Her daughter was in grade 6, and it was write at least 5+ positive stories, facts about the residential schools from these different websites. And they had given them the websites to go look at. This mom was not so happy about that assignment from her daughter. And then, of course, as our culture does, it blew up on social media when she posted a clip of her, severely traumatized by the fact that her daughter her daughter, she's Indigenous, and her daughter is Indigenous, has Indigenous heritage, and came to her and said, I've been asked to write a report saying, what are some of the positives of residential schools, and of course on social media people jumped on it and said it would be like, what was the positives of the Holocaust, or what was the positives of other things? I mean, certainly there was good things. And so this kind of consistent, and I think it plays into that one of those agreements, right? We're not comfortable with painting something as negative and difficult and upsetting and traumatizing and something we need to be held accountable for. We want to make ourselves feel a little better by saying, oh, but still, like, and we've heard these things even this past week. Well, at least they were taught in education. Maybe they had more regularity of meals. Maybe they had at least a roof over their heads that was different. It just dismisses the reality of the trauma of that experience writ large on a community of people, for the sake of people like me just feeling a little better about that whole situation. And I think Kate spoke to last week when we talked about the confession, and what was the word you didn't like in the confession, Kate? You had a word you particularly did not enjoy. Do you remember what that word was?
Oh, I can't remember. I thought it was sort of like that it was an inconvenience, but it was like a word that almost didn't feel strong enough.
Right.
I'd have to look at it again.
Yeah. It was something along the lines of, we recognize that might have been upsetting, a touch upsetting what we did. And you were looking for something more like, could you label it something like horrific, traumatizing, devastating, brutal, awful, horrible, like.
Maybe it was inconvenience or something.
Inconvenient.
Like
How inconvenient.
Residential schools were inconvenient.
Exactly. Yeah.
It was.
Yeah. But I also bring up this article because it's as recent as, just a few days ago. And before we started the recording, Rhonda had mentioned that the Minister for Indigenous Affairs mentioned today that the Liberal government is not going to meet its target. Surprise, not against Liberals, any government. They're not going to meet their target, of course, related to Indigenous peoples, of course. Now they've done something, which is true. They claim to have addressed 97 of the boil water advisories. They've at least addressed 97. That leaves 59, and 40 some odd. That represents like 40 some odd communities who still don't have, drinking water. But they claim that maybe by the spring, that number might be down to 12. But that's still 12 communities or more that don't have drinking water. So it's good, but it's not great. And again, you've made a commitment. The Prime Minister, the representative of the government, made a commitment that within 5 years they would address that. I mean, my own daughter, who's taking Indigenous studies and also did a little something last term, I think she wrote in her language, it's crazy that this hasn't been dealt with. Maybe not the best word, but it's crazy that this hasn't been addressed. Like to say, oh, you don't have water, drinking water, in 5 years you'll have it. Like, there's got to be a way of addressing that a lot quicker. We wouldn't accept that again in certain communities. So still something to be, engaging us. So I just want to wrap up a couple of the final discussion questions. There's actually quite a few, but I just want to go through some of these quickly and maybe highlight a couple of things just again, for the sake of our time and to be fair for our time. If you could sum up in like a word or a phrase, what would you say was, what was the most important thing you might have learned from this these past few weeks? One thing, just in a popcorny kind of way. What one thing would you say stood out for you? Could be a concept, a specific fact, or anything.
One thing that I would like to know is how many schools the Presbyterian Church had.
For sure, yeah. I'd have to go dig in to find the actual information. One thing that I never liked about the Presbyterian Church in Canada, because when I was going through school related to residential schools, because at that time when I was going to Knox College, so some 20 years ago, we were just in the midst of the litigation process that was coming out. There were denominations were being charged, class action lawsuits, the Roman Catholic Church, the United Church, Presbyterian Church, Anglican Church. And one of the things that we used to say back then that I heard was, well, it's okay because we only had a few schools. I think we were down to maybe half a dozen post-union. And when I say post-union, in 1925, the Presbyterian Church in Canada stepped away from church union, which was the union of Presbyterian churches, Methodist churches, and Congregationalist churches into the United Church of Canada. And the United Church of Canada became, a body, and they took over almost all of the residential schools. So we, by virtue of that act of Parliament, when the United Church of Canada became to be, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, the sustaining Presbyterian Church of Canada, only had a few. And so our legal impact is much, much less. But pre-1925, we were the ones who created it. Like we were at the table designing residential schools. We were one of the groups that designed it. And so we had a lot more than we actually will be on the hook for legally. The United Church of Canada will have more litigation related to those ones. But yeah, I'd have to look at the numbers. It's probably a quick Google search you'd find how many total the United Church and Presbyterian Church had. And that would give you a good sense of how many we had pre-1925.
There was, remember I didn't specify the denominations, but there is a link that provides a map to where all the residential schools are in Canada. And it's designed in a way where if you typed in your own address, or you would see where's the closest one. It's kind of a neat interactive map to figure out where they were.
Yeah, and you can click in the year. So for myself, I was able to type in like Burlington or a postal code or something, and then like year that I was living there. and it showed me the closest residential school, and I can type in Guelph now. You know, generally speaking, if you have lived in Southern Ontario for most of your life, it will tell you Brantford. There was one basically in near Six Nations or on Six Nations. But if you live in the north, you might find other ones that are around. I think it's partly to address that sort of issue of, I didn't know they existed. Like clearly there was none, like I never knew there was one existed. But for most of us who live in Guelph or lived in the GTA or in this southern Ontario, probably Brantford will be the one that comes up. But it's a great little site to check that out. Other things that folks have learned?
For me, it was today's reading about the role of women and how, and we touched on it too last week, how women were so devalued by the colonizing people and our culture of male superiority, how that has played out in to the very real facts of so many missing and murdered Indigenous women, and that's shocking to me. And I just hadn't thought that one through very well, and that's been the big revelation for me.
Yeah, thank you, Rhonda. Yeah.
For me, I am quite disappointed knowing the Christian Church teaches, supposedly teaches good values, but it was abused in this situation. They took advantage of the Indigenous people.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, as human beings, we know this. This is the story that's told for generations, right? People should profess and say they have a certain way of viewing the world, but when that comes to play, it doesn't happen. Because you would think that people who would be able to affirm that we're to love one another as we would want to be loved and to love our neighbors as ourselves, that we wouldn't participate in some of the things that happened in residential schools, for sure. Anyone else want to offer a thought before we move on?
I think that there are a lot of good Indigenous authors. And you learn a lot from these authors.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a lot more now. Yeah, there's whole reading lists of Indigenous authors that folks can read. And certainly Guelph we have our Tom King, and there's a lot of other ones out there who've written some really amazing books to really open our eyes to that story. And it's told in the voice of an Indigenous person, not from somebody who's writing it, as a more of a journalist kind of perspective. So let's look at this little question for a moment as well. So as one of the first discussion questions asked in this study, in what ways do you think the church contributed to this genocide? And in what ways do you think the church could have resisted, and how can we do so? Anything that comes to mind, thinking about how we've looked at this material and engaged this material? I mean, I think I confessed at one point, if I had been a minister in 1918 or 1920 or something, it's one of the options for my employment would be, I assume, working at a residential school. And would I have participated in that? Would I have seen it? Would I have known what was going on, or the complexity of that space in the 1920s? Or, seeing as there was one in 1996 still existing, I don't think it was Presbyterian, but, as a church person, would I be participating in that in some way as a minister? So it has, any thoughts on this? How do you resist it? How could the church have resisted it? What could have happened? I mean, any...
Or did speak up? Like, I think part of it is in that moment, right? Like, or in that historical context, people thought they were doing the right thing. And here we are sitting in 2020 being judgmental and realizing and knowing that they didn't do the right thing. But in that time, no, like they would have been steeped in their own doctrine of women are lesser and white European ways are the best way. So would anybody have said, hey, like this is wrong, like why are we doing this? I just wonder.
Well, and the truth is that there was, like I think I referenced him, might have been in the first first episode, we talked about the chief medical officer of health in Canada had said these are the conditions in the residential schools are grievous and something should be done. So at least around the conditions of the residential schools, like the living conditions and some of the stuff there was an outcry and people decided not to listen to it. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges is, and these are the kind of conversations we have even around, big things like the Holocaust. How do people, what makes people participate in something that systemically is wrong, or causing harm to others? What, because I think the conversation we're having is everybody who participated in the residential schools necessarily isn't individually to blame, I suppose. The fact that they existed and were supported by larger systemic institutional bodies, the government, the church, that's the wider question. So, and it's easy to talk about Nazis and the Holocaust. That's one thing. But even within that conversation, it's like, how do you in good conscience as a person, as a human being, participate in a concentration camp? Now you're a soldier and you're told to do it. And as I would understand it, if you chose not to, then there'd be punishment for that. There could be even death for that. But is that what it takes? That's the kind of questions, like, how far are we willing to go to stop certain things from happening? Because certainly that's there, during the Holocaust, there were people, there were Christians, there were other people in Germany who were opposed to what was going on. And when they became aware of other things that were going on, they took a stand and they died for that. With the residential schools, that's the question. I haven't done enough research of my own, and I would have to do more to get a sense of, were there ministers? Were there people who had worked there? Were there whistleblowers, as we have today? Were there people who were saying, this is not right, we should stop this, this must stop? I don't know.
I was going to say, like, that kind of whistleblower, in instances, throughout history and different things that have happened over time, oftentimes it's a whistleblower that, things change as a result. But it's just, you just got to wonder at the time, right? Like, and witnessing that, and even the RCMP and ripping children away from their families, and was anybody saying, like, man, like, this is wrong? But anyways, we can move on.
Yeah, and I think it's a good question of, how do we as human beings get blurred, right? So if we believe a certain worldview, then the perspective must be that it's okay, right? So the idea of, we're going to make these young Indigenous children, we're going to make them full Canadian citizens. It's going to be super. Or this rightness, this idea that we have the right way of thinking and it's just going to be super and it's going to be better. Certainly how we did missionaries, sending them to other countries and basically imposing this on people, and saying we have the right way of thinking and the right way of being. Again, there's an arrogance to that is maybe a little easier for 21st century people to critique than the past, because there might have been, although there would be diversity of opinion, and a lot of what we get is the history written by the people in power and privilege. What was the average Joe thinking about people of power and privilege sending missionaries to other countries to evangelize the heathen, when they were living in poverty in their own community and wondering, when's the government going to do something to address our issues? I don't know. Those are big questions. Dallas, did you want to get in there?
I was going to say, we're literally still doing that today, whether it be missionaries, whether it be the last 30 years of wars in Iraq and the Middle East. We are literally doing exactly that same thing today. It's changing, we have more people, I think, standing up. We have the Greta Thunbergs. We have the, you know, we have, you know, the some politicians that are. We have people like yourself, like us. But it's still happening. It's not.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, I've
And
got
I think,
nothing.
and I was going to say too, I think we are complicit in a lot of other oppressive ways that are going on in society, and you know, and the racism that exists broadly as well. So in many other things in life too. So I think we've still got a lot of work to do, and we aren't you know, innocent ourselves in any way. It's just that residential schools, or the Indigenous experience, and that's still going on, is something that we're turning our mind to, and kind of seeing historically the trouble. But through what the things that we've done in our lifetimes are going to be looked back on as well as being probably equally as oppressive.
Yeah, for sure. I always say I'm really curious as to what someone is going to be speaking about in a study, you know, 50 years from now, if there are still studies, you know, about what I was a part of, and where where was my blind spots, you know, like how could they even think that was okay? And it's like, oh, I didn't know that wasn't okay. I didn't, you know, what are my blind spots? So yeah, we do need to be always unpacking some of that. I want to move us to the close, so I'm going to move on from those couple of questions. I want to give essentially the last word to one of the speakers from the study, or from the inquiry, Penelope. She was one of the grandmothers guiding the national inquiry on the experience of hearing the stories brought to the inquiry, and this is what she had to say. It's striking too, all their stories. They show how fragile we are, and at the same time how strong we are. And it still continues today. That's what strikes me, and how resilient we are. And so as we close tonight, I'm going to close this with the prayer that's included in the guide. I would encourage any one of us, you who've joined us on this 4-week study, you who are watching on YouTube afterwards, do look up the Presbyterian Church in Canada's website, presbyterian.ca, and look under Justice Ministries, or type in Social Action Hub, and you can find a whole variety of information related to colonialism and racism, Indigenous studies and things like that, just to make those connection points. So I'd encourage you to check that out. A lot of this material is difficult and challenging to listen to and to hear. So again, always take time for yourself to recuperate from these conversations. And the other thing I would just raise up for you, you know, I'm not somebody who likes to sort of just talk about stuff. I love to have ways of doing some tangibleness. I am committing to doing something again in the new year. I don't know what that'll be. I've been talking to Justice Ministries about what they might have coming along, but there's also some ones that I've never done before that we could also engage in. I'm still working on building relationships with some of the Indigenous communities here in this area, and you know, we'll see how those conversations go, and whether there's tangible things we could do with those communities. That would be great. Through Anne's connection with Rotary, I was able to talk to a woman by the name of Diane Dance, and she was in the Guelph Today a few weeks back, related to Rotary's project with Water First. So you can find Water First. It's an NGO in Canada that's doing work in Canada. Rotary's made a contribution to a significant financial contribution to this project. Basically, they're an NGO that works on, you know, essentially providing. Sometimes it's providing the equipment. Sometimes it's providing parts and stuff to repair the equipment, and it also provides internships for Indigenous young people to learn how to fix equipment related to water purification. And so they have a pretty bold goal. I don't know if you know, I'm not sure if they're going to beat the government in addressing some of these issues, or I'm not sure how much they're partnering with the government. I don't think they are able to in some ways. But certainly Water First is something to look into, and I'll provide some links for that in the YouTube video as well. I did talk to Diane about ways in which we as a church could be a part of that. It sounds like the project with Rotary is complete for now, and they're looking to do a project in the future. And so I may encourage us at some point to partner with them on that project. The other thing we did talk about was there was a show called First Contact, which was on TVO about non-Indigenous peoples going on sort of an exposure tour with Indigenous people. It was a great show. And her and I talked about maybe we could do a public showing or watching of it in some way, using virtual means now, and then having a discussion group or conversation group. So there could be a couple of tangible actions that way. And I'd love for us to do that. Yeah. So let's close with prayer, and then we'll wrap up for this evening. And I'm using the prayer that's found in the study. So let's pray. Loving and healing God, you have called us by name. You know each of our needs, the stories of our hearts and minds and bodies, and know when any one of your beloved creations is hurting or harmed. Where we have been complicit in trauma or caused harm, we repent and seek to change our actions. We need healing. Those of us who have lost loved ones to the violence this report names. Those of us who live with the trauma of colonization and genocide on our families. And those of us who grew up without daily witness of the harm in which we too have been complicit. Bring healing to grieving families missing their loved ones with an ache too fierce to be borne. Help us to change systems that cause violence, trauma, and death. Guide us as we pursue instead supporting those rights to culture and health, security, and justice for Indigenous people that are named in this report. We recognize, loving God, that one more murder, one more disappearance is already too much, and was too much with each life already lost. So we ask you to give us the strength and the will to seek justice, to create safety and well-being in your name. Amen. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate you spending some time with us over the last 4 weeks. You've been stalwart in your participation, and hope you'll join us again maybe for another in a series like this in the future when we get a chance to continue this work on anti-racism. All of this will be posted on our website under the anti-racism banner, Why Work to Decolonize tab, and they'll be on our YouTube channel very soon. So thanks. Really appreciate you being with me.
Thank you, John. It's been